The hospital received him late at night, when corridors were quieter and exhaustion hung in the air like a second ceiling. For the Korean man, stepping into the building felt unnatural. He ruled spaces where fear spoke before words, where his presence bent people into silence. Hospitals were different. Power softened here, replaced by urgency, routine, and the quiet authority of those who healed rather than commanded. He had come because someone under his protection needed care, and failure was not an option. Even here, his posture remained controlled, his expression unreadable, his mind already calculating outcomes. He moved through the entrance with the same precision he carried everywhere, dressed sharply despite the hour, his dark coat falling perfectly against his frame. People sensed him before they understood why. Some stepped aside instinctively, others glanced up and quickly looked away. He noticed everything, yet nothing truly held his attention until a small moment interrupted the rhythm he expected. Across the ward, a black nurse worked with calm focus, her movements steady and practiced. She carried fatigue in her shoulders but not in her hands. Her skin caught the soft hospital light, and her natural hair was pulled back neatly, practical and unadorned. There was no rush in her manner, no sign that she felt watched or intimidated. She was simply doing her job, fully present in a way that felt rare and honest. What struck him first was not attraction but dissonance. She did not react to him the way others did. There was no hesitation, no nervous energy, no careful calculation in her posture. She existed in her own rhythm, untouched by the invisible weight he carried. That alone drew his attention more sharply than beauty ever could. As he waited, his gaze returned to her without effort. He watched how she moved from task to task, how she adjusted equipment with gentle efficiency, how her focus never wavered even as the night pressed on. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience shaped by long hours and unspoken burdens. He recognized that kind of strength immediately. It was the same kind that survived without applause. For the first time in a long while, impatience left him. The urgency that had brought him there remained, but it no longer consumed him entirely. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, subtle and unwelcome. Curiosity, slow and persistent, replaced the sharp edge of control he usually relied on. He told himself it was nothing. Hospitals created strange pauses, moments where life reminded even the most powerful men that they were still human. Yet his eyes kept finding her. He noticed the slight crease between her brows when she concentrated, the way she exhaled softly after completing a task, the discipline it took to remain gentle in a place where suffering never truly slept. She, meanwhile, remained unaware of the significance he carried beyond the walls of the hospital. To her, he was simply another man waiting, another presence among many. That anonymity unsettled him more than recognition ever had. He was used to being known, feared, anticipated. Being unseen felt like standing without armor. The night stretched on, and the hospital continued its quiet work around them. He remained still, observing, waiting, his mind caught between responsibility and a growing awareness he could not dismiss. Something about this place, about her presence within it, had disrupted his certainty. He had come expecting efficiency, control, and resolution. What he encountered instead was the beginning of a shift he did not yet understand. By the time the moment passed, nothing outward had changed. No lines were crossed. No words were exchanged. Yet something subtle had already taken root. In a place meant for healing, the Korean man felt the first stirrings of something dangerous and unexpected, an interest that did not come from power or desire alone, but from the quiet pull of a woman who stood entirely outside his world. The first impression settled into him quietly, without drama, without force, which made it all the more unsettling. He was accustomed to instant reactions, fear tightening faces, respect straightening spines, curiosity mixed with caution. With her, there was none of that. When she finally noticed him, her eyes met his briefly and moved on just as naturally, as if he were no different from any other man waiting under the sterile lights of the hospital. That absence of reaction stayed with him. She approached her duties with a calm professionalism that felt unbreakable. Her posture was steady, her expression composed, and even in moments of pressure she did not rush. There was a softness in the way she moved, but not weakness. It was the softness of someone who had learned patience through hardship, who understood pain without being consumed by it. He noticed how she listened carefully, how her attention never drifted, how she carried responsibility without complaint. When she addressed him as part of her work, there was respect in her manner but no submission. Her tone remained neutral, her focus precise. She did not attempt to impress him, nor did she seem curious about his status. He felt something shift, then a faint tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with being stripped of it. He studied her more closely after that, not openly, but with the quiet intensity he reserved for things that mattered. Her face held traces of exhaustion, yet her eyes remained clear. She carried herself as someone who had learned to keep going regardless of how heavy life became. That resilience drew him in deeper than attraction alone ever could. For her part, she sensed his attention without fully acknowledging it. Years of working long shifts had sharpened her awareness of people without making her reactive. She felt his gaze occasionally, steady and unreadable, but she did not let it distract her. Men had looked at her before, some with interest, some with entitlement. His was different, less demanding, more restrained, but she refused to assign meaning to it. What she did notice was his silence. He did not fill space with authority or impatience. He waited. That alone set him apart. Still, she kept her distance, grounded in routine, unwilling to blur the boundaries she relied on to protect herself. Inside him, however, boundaries were already shifting. He found himself measuring moments by her presence, noticing when she moved out of sight and when she returned. The hospital noise faded around him, replaced by a quiet awareness that he had not planned for. He was not drawn to fantasy or illusion, but to something solid and real, a woman rooted in purpose, untouched by his reputation. The realization disturbed him. First impressions were usually shallow, easily dismissed. This one lingered, carried weight. He recognized it as the kind that changed direction, not suddenly but inevitably. And though he did not yet understand why, he knew this first impression would not be his last. What unsettled him most was not her presence, but her refusal to bend around it. She did not adjust her behavior to suit him, did not soften or sharpen herself in response to the quiet authority he carried. She remained exactly who she was: professional, composed, and self-contained. That steadiness challenged him in ways he had not anticipated. He was used to people changing around him. Voices lowered. Movements became careful. Even confident individuals revealed cracks when they realized who stood before them. Power had a way of reshaping the air. Yet she moved through that air untouched, as if it belonged to her just as much as it did to anyone else. That equality, unspoken and unintentional, disrupted the balance he relied on. He noticed how she set limits without effort. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with quiet certainty. Her attention remained where it was needed, and when her work required distance, she maintained it without apology. There was no invitation in her demeanor, no silent request for approval. She did not seek validation from him, and that absence drew him closer than any calculated charm could have. For the first time in years, he felt reduced to simply being a man in a room, stripped of the layers that usually defined him. That vulnerability irritated him at first. He told himself it was temporary, a reaction to unfamiliar surroundings and fatigue. But the feeling did not fade. Instead, it sharpened his awareness of her. She, meanwhile, remained anchored in her own reality. She sensed his presence more clearly now, not as threat, not as comfort, but as something watchful. There was weight in the way he observed, a stillness that suggested restraint rather than indifference. She did not know his world, but she understood control when she saw it. She recognized it in the way he held himself, in the discipline etched into every movement. Still, she did not yield to it. Her independence was not loud or performative. It was built from necessity. Life had taught her to stand her ground quietly, to protect her space without confrontation. That instinct guided her now. She kept her focus, her boundaries intact, even as awareness flickered between them. For him, that refusal to bow became a turning point. It sparked respect first, then something deeper. He admired strength wherever he found it, But this was different. This was strength that did not challenge him directly, yet refused to be overshadowed. It existed on its own terms, and that made it dangerous to his sense of control. He realized then that what he felt was not simple attraction. It was the pull of something unfamiliar, something that did not submit to power or fear. A woman who met the world head-on, quietly and completely, without knowing or caring who stood before her. And in that realization, the distance between them meant to be firm and impersonal began to blur, not through action, but through awareness alone. The moment arrived without warning, carried on the fragile balance that had been building between them since their first encounter. It was not planned, nor was it accidental. It was simply the natural result of proximity stretched too long, of restraint tested repeatedly until it thinned. He moved closer, not out of impulse, but with intention sharpened by control. Every step he took toward her was measured, every breath deliberate. She felt him before she understood what was happening. The space around her shifted, tightening in a way that made her acutely aware of her own body. Her spine straightened instinctively, her breath slowing as if her senses had decided to listen more carefully. She did not turn right away. She did not step back. Some part of her recognized that whatever was unfolding could not be undone by distance alone. When he leaned in, it was not aggressive, not hurried. It was precise. His presence filled the space beside her, close enough that warmth replaced air. The subtle brush of his breath against her skin sent a sharp, unexpected reaction through her, stealing the rhythm from her lungs. Her breath caught, suspended between inhale and exhale, as if her body had forgotten its own instinct. The closeness was overwhelming because nothing else happened. No touch broke the moment. No sound disturbed it. The restraint itself became the force. She felt exposed in a way she had not experienced before, not because she was being watched, but because she was being felt. Seen beyond surfaces, aware that he was choosing not to cross a line, and that choice made the tension heavier than action ever could. Inside him, control wavered. He was used to leaning into fear, into obedience, into surrender. This was different. Her stillness did not invite possession. It demanded awareness. He felt the pull of her response, the subtle change in her posture, the held breath that told him she was affected. The knowledge settled deep, dangerous, and intoxicating. He could step back, and he did, but the moment had already marked them both. For her, the seconds stretched into something timeless. Desire rose uninvited, tangled with caution and disbelief. She had learned to guard herself carefully, to read signs and retreat before vulnerability could take root. Yet this was not a moment she could simply dismiss. It had reached somewhere quiet and private, awakening a part of her she had kept dormant for survival's sake. When the space between them finally widened again, nothing outward had changed. The world continued as it had before. But internally, everything had shifted. The whisper of closeness lingered in her awareness, echoing through her thoughts, her body still reacting to a presence no longer touching her. For him, the realization was just as profound. He had crossed no visible boundary, yet he knew he had stepped into something irreversible. The power he wielded elsewhere meant nothing here. In that single, restrained moment, he had lost a piece of control not to weakness, but to connection. And the knowledge that he could affect her without touching her became both a temptation and a warning he could not ignore. After that moment, silence became heavier than words ever could have been. She carried it with her, the memory of that closeness settling deep beneath her calm exterior. Outwardly, she remained composed, continuing her work with the same discipline she had always relied on. Inwardly, however, her thoughts refused to quiet. Her body remembered what her mind tried to deny, and that awareness followed her long after distance returned between them. She questioned herself relentlessly. She reminded herself of everything she had learned the hard way: how desire could weaken judgment, how attachment could become a liability. Her life had been shaped by responsibility, not indulgence. There was no space for longing, no safety in wanting what belonged to danger. Yet the memory did not fade. It returned in quiet moments, in pauses between tasks, in the slow rhythm of her breathing when exhaustion lowered her guard. He too was unsettled. Control had always been his refuge, the structure that kept chaos at bay. The ease with which that control had slipped, even briefly, disturbed him more than open confrontation ever could. He replayed the moment with precision, analyzing his own restraint, her reaction, the unspoken exchange that had occurred without consent or permission. It was not weakness he felt, but exposure. For the first time in years, he found himself hesitating not in action, but in thought. He measured distance more carefully, aware of how easily proximity had shifted his focus. He recognized the danger in allowing curiosity to deepen into obsession, yet the effort to suppress it only sharpened his awareness of her presence. Restraint became a conscious act rather than an instinct, and that alone marked a change he could not undo. She struggled with the duality inside her. Fear and desire existed side by side, neither strong enough to silence the other. She knew enough about men like him to understand the risks, even without knowing the full truth of his world. Power always carried a cost, and proximity to it often demanded payment. Still, something about him resisted easy categorization. He had not taken what he could have. He had stepped back when he did not need to. That restraint confused her more than aggression ever would have. Their awareness of each other grew sharper in absence rather than presence. Every shared space felt charged, every near encounter layered with unspoken meaning. She avoided meeting his gaze for too long, not out of submission, but self-preservation. He watched her with equal care, aware that one wrong move could shatter the fragile balance forming between them. Internally, he battled something unfamiliar, the urge to protect what he desired rather than possess it. It went against everything he had built his life upon. Wanting without taking felt like standing unarmed, yet he found himself choosing that vulnerability again and again. In her, he saw not an object of conquest, but a boundary he did not wish to cross recklessly. For her, the conflict deepened into quiet longing. She did not dream of him in romantic illusions, but she felt his presence in the spaces he left behind. Her breath would change unexpectedly, her focus falter for a brief second, reminding her that control was not only his burden to carry. Both of them existed in that tension, suspended between caution and desire, each aware that something had begun that neither had invited. The moment had passed, but its echo remained, shaping their thoughts, testing their restraint, and forcing them to confront parts of themselves they had long kept hidden. As her awareness of him deepened, fragments of truth began to surface, quietly and without invitation. It was not something he offered, nor something she sought directly, but the weight of his presence carried history within it. People around him moved differently, voices lowered when he passed, tension tightening the air in subtle ways she could not ignore. Over time, patterns emerged, and understanding followed. She realized that the calm control he carried was not natural ease, but something forged under pressure. His discipline was too precise, his restraint too practiced to belong to an ordinary life. Power clung to him not as decoration, but as armor. The knowledge unsettled her. She had spent years navigating hardship, but this was a different kind of danger, one that did not announce itself loudly, one that waited patiently. For him, the past was not something he revisited lightly. It lived beneath his skin, shaping every decision, every boundary he enforced. He had learned early that survival required dominance, that mercy was a weakness others exploited. The world he came from did not reward hesitation, and it never forgot mistakes. He had built himself carefully within that reality, piece by piece, until nothing could reach him without consequence. Yet her presence disturbed that structure. The contrast between her life and his sharpened the edges of his memory. She moved through her days with integrity shaped by necessity, not ambition. Where his past was marked by blood and control, hers was defined by endurance and care. The difference pulled at him, forcing reflection he had long avoided. She sensed the darkness without fully understanding it. It showed in the way his attention never drifted, in the way his stillness felt prepared rather than relaxed. She understood then that getting close to him meant stepping near a history she could not soften or fix. That knowledge frightened her, but it also clarified something important. Whatever existed between them could not be simple, for him. Revealing nothing was a form of protection of himself and of her. He knew what his world did to those who stood too near. He had seen innocence crushed by association, kindness exploited as leverage. The restraint he practiced around her was not only desire held back. It was warning, a silent attempt to keep her untouched by the consequences that followed him. The distance between their lives became clearer, heavier. She carried the truth carefully, weighing it against what she felt. Attraction alone could not erase reality. Yet she also recognized that the darkness around him did not define everything he was. It explained his control, his caution, his refusal to act without thought. In understanding that, fear mingled with empathy. For the first time, both of them stood fully aware of the line between their worlds. His past was not gone. It waited patiently behind him. Hers demanded stability, safety, and trust. The connection forming between them did not dissolve under that weight. It sharpened, becoming more deliberate, more restrained. What emerged was not illusion, but clarity. Whatever drew them together existed in spite of the darkness, not because of it. And in that realization, the stakes rose quietly, binding them not through action, but through the shared knowledge that stepping closer would change everything. With the truth now resting between them, the space they shared became charged in a new way. Awareness replaced uncertainty, and caution shaped every movement. What once felt like accidental closeness now carried intention, and that intention blurred the boundaries they both tried to maintain. Neither of them reached out, yet the pull between them grew stronger, fed by restraint rather than release. She found herself noticing him more deliberately, not with innocence but with understanding. She saw the discipline in the way he held himself, the careful distance he maintained, the restraint that followed every glance. It was clear now that his control was not indifference but choice. That realization softened something inside her. Even as it made her more wary, he, in turn, became acutely aware of her reactions. The slight changes in her posture, the way her breath shifted when he was near, the moments when her focus wavered before she steadied herself again. These were small signs, but to him they were unmistakable. He recognized desire held tightly in check, and the recognition deepened his own. The line between them blurred not through touch, but through shared silence. Every unspoken moment carried weight. Their eyes met more often now, holding just long enough to acknowledge what neither would name. The absence of words created a space where tension thrived, where imagination filled the gaps restraint left behind. She struggled to keep her distance, knowing how easily awareness could turn into attachment. Yet the effort itself revealed how much she had already crossed into dangerous territory. She was no longer merely reacting to him. She was anticipating him. That realization unsettled her, forcing her to confront the vulnerability she had tried so hard to avoid. For him, the blurring of lines tested his discipline. He was accustomed to drawing clear boundaries and enforcing them without hesitation. With her, those boundaries became flexible, shaped by consideration rather than command. He did not move closer, but he did not step away either. He allowed the tension to exist, choosing presence over withdrawal. What formed between them was neither innocence nor surrender. It was a charged balance, held together by mutual awareness and careful restraint. Each moment felt as though it could tip in either direction, toward distance or toward something far more consuming. The danger was not in what they did, but in how easily they could imagine crossing the line. In that suspended state, both of them changed. She became more aware of her own desires, no longer able to deny them entirely. He became more aware of his limits, discovering that control could coexist with longing. The lines between them did not disappear, but they grew thin enough to feel fragile, as if one unguarded moment could erase them completely. The breaking point arrived quietly, without drama, carried on a shift in balance neither of them had prepared for. The world he belonged to, so carefully contained, began to leak into the edges of her life. It was subtle at first, changes in atmosphere, a tightening of caution around her that she could feel even when she could not explain it. She sensed that her proximity to him had altered something beyond emotion, that attention had consequences. For him, the realization came sharply. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was no longer about temptation or restraint. It was about responsibility. His world reacted to what he valued, and whether he acknowledged it or not, she had become something he was unwilling to risk. The thought unsettled him, not because he feared conflict, but because he feared what proximity to him could cost her. He moved with precision then, not toward her, but around her life. Protection took shape without announcement, without display. He removed threats before they could surface, closed paths before they could lead to harm. It was the same decisiveness he used everywhere else, but this time it was guided by something unfamiliar: care without ownership, action without demand. She felt the shift even without understanding its source. A sense of unease followed by an equally strong sense of safety, as though something unseen stood between her and the world. That contradiction troubled her. She had learned to rely on herself, to trust only what she could control. Feeling protected without consent challenged that independence, yet it also revealed the depth of his restraint. He did not step closer. He did not claim credit. He simply ensured that she remained untouched by the consequences of his attention. Inside him, the breaking point forced a reckoning. He could no longer pretend that what he felt was contained or harmless. Protecting her meant exposure of his priorities, of his vulnerability, of the one place where control bent toward care. It was a risk he would have condemned in others, yet he accepted it without hesitation. For her, the realization followed slowly. She understood that whatever stood between them had crossed into something irreversible. This was no longer just tension or blurred boundaries. It was proof. Proof that his restraint was intentional, that his distance was not indifference, and that his presence carried both danger and shelter. The balance shifted then. Not toward resolution, but toward truth. They stood on opposite sides of a line that had already been tested, both aware that something had been broken open not by touch or confession, but by the undeniable fact that protecting each other now mattered more than maintaining distance. The moment demanded a choice neither of them had been ready to make, yet both had been moving toward all along. For her, the weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. She had spent years building a life defined by caution and endurance, learning to survive without relying on anyone else. The connection forming now threatened that hard-won stability. Staying near him meant accepting uncertainty, danger, and emotions she had never allowed herself to fully feel. Walking away promised safety, but at the cost of something she could no longer pretend did not matter. She examined her fear honestly. It was not only fear of his world, but fear of her own response to him. The way her body reacted, the way her thoughts lingered, the way silence between them had begun to feel meaningful rather than empty. Love, she realized, was not always loud or comforting. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as awareness, demanding courage rather than surrender. For him, the choice cut even deeper. Control had shaped every part of his life, keeping weakness hidden and vulnerability contained. Wanting her had already disrupted that structure. Protecting her had exposed it. Now he faced a decision no power could simplify: whether to continue down a path that risked her safety, or to step back and lose something he had never intended to claim. He understood the cost of both options. Letting her go would preserve her life as it was, untouched by the shadows he carried. Holding on, even carefully, would bind her to consequences she had not chosen. Love, in his world, was not a gift. It was a liability. Yet denying it felt like a different kind of loss, one that would follow him long after distance returned. Neither of them spoke the truth aloud, but it lived clearly between them. Choice and consequence were no longer abstract ideas. They were present, immediate, and unavoidable. She stood at the edge of change, aware that whatever she decided would reshape her future. He stood equally still, knowing that for once, control required restraint rather than command. In that shared awareness, something solidified. Not a promise, not a resolution, but understanding. Love did not erase danger, and danger did not erase love. Both existed together, demanding honesty and courage in equal measure. The choice remained unresolved, suspended in the space between them. Yet even without action, the consequences had already begun. They were no longer the people they had been before crossing paths. Whatever came next would be shaped by that truth, and neither of them could step away unchanged. The ending did not arrive as closure, but as continuation quiet, unresolved, and deeply felt. What lay between them had grown beyond momentary tension or guarded curiosity. It had become a presence of its own, woven into their awareness, shaping how they moved through their separate lives. There was no dramatic conclusion, no clear crossing of lines, yet nothing returned to how it had been before. She carried the weight of what remained unsaid with a new kind of strength. It was not the strength of denial, but of acceptance. She understood now that love did not always demand possession or certainty. Sometimes it existed as restraint, as choice repeated daily, as the courage to feel without surrendering everything. Her life continued, grounded in purpose, yet marked by a quiet warmth she had not known before. For him, the unfinished ending was both burden and anchor. He returned to a world that obeyed him, yet found that obedience no longer satisfied him in the same way. Control still defined his actions, but it was tempered by awareness. He had learned that power could protect as much as it could destroy, and that restraint could be stronger than force. The knowledge stayed with him, reshaping how he measured risk and loyalty. What connected them remained delicate and intact precisely because it was unresolved. They had not claimed each other, yet they had changed each other. The absence of certainty preserved something pure within the danger, a connection built on respect, restraint, and the willingness to protect rather than consume. The memory of that closeness lingered like a quiet echo. For her, it was a reminder that she was seen beyond circumstance. For him, it was proof that control did not have to erase humanity. Neither knew whether their paths would cross again, or whether time would soften what distance preserved. The story ended where it began, in awareness. Two lives altered by a connection neither expected, bound not by promises or declarations, but by a shared understanding that something real had existed between them. Love remained at the edge of danger, unclaimed yet undeniable, waiting in the silence for whatever future dared to approach it.